Dr. Eleanor Vance felt the weight of the Thorne Ferrers archive not as a burden, but as a profound responsibility. The initial excitement of discovery, the thrill of academic detective work, had gradually given way to a more sober contemplation of the lives she had unearthed. Elias Thorne, Livia Ferrars, Alaric Finch, they were no longer mere names in dusty documents, but presences that inhabited her thoughts, their joys and sorrows echoing across the centuries. Her research for the Thorne ciphers had been exhaustive. She had walked the streets of Bloomsbury, where Elias had lived out his final, melancholic years, trying to imagine the oppressive silence of his study, the scent of old books and dying embers. She had stood in the grand, impersonal halls of what was once the Foreign Office, picturing a younger, more vibrant Elias navigating its treacherous currents, and a brilliant Livia Ferrars matching wits with seasoned diplomats, her idealism a fragile shield against the cynicism of the age. She had stood in the grand, impersonal halls of what was once the Foreign Office, picturing a younger, more vibrant Elias navigating its treacherous currents, and a brilliant Livia Ferrars matching wits with seasoned diplomats, her idealism a fragile shield against the cynicism men need. In Paris, Eleanor had sought out the modest arrondissements where Livia was said to have spent her last years. There were no plaques, no monuments, only the indifferent city, constantly reinventing itself, erasing the footprints of its more obscure inhabitants. She found a record of Livia's burial in a crowded cemetery, a simple entry in a ledger, her name just one among thousands. It was a stark reminder of how easily a life, however luminous, could be extinguished and forgotten. The unsent letters from Elias to Livia became the emotional core of Eleanor's book. She reproduced them in full, their raw anguish a counterpoint to the dry, official records of diplomatic intrigue. She analysed Thorne's elegant, tormented prose, noting the classical allusions he used to frame his guilt, the subtle shifts in tone as hope for Livia's forgiveness battled with his despair. She also highlighted the significance of Alaric Finch's role, not just as a caretaker, but as a conscious archivist, a man who had understood the profound human tragedy behind his mentor's scholarly facade, and had taken quiet, patient steps to ensure its eventual, albeit posthumous, revelation. Finch, Eleanor argued, was the unsung hero of the story, the conduit through which Thorne's silent confession could finally reach the world, and through which Livia's memory could be, in some small measure, redeemed. The publication of the Thorne ciphers had, as expected, generated more scholarly debate than public sensation. There were those who praised Eleanor's meticulous research and her empathetic portrayal of her subjects. Others, particularly those with a vested interest in maintaining the traditional heroic narratives of British diplomacy, were more critical, accusing her of over-interpreting private correspondence, of imposing modern sensibilities onto historical figures. One particularly scathing review in a conservative journal had dismissed Thorne's letters as the self-indulgent ramblings of a senile academic, given undue prominence by a historian more interested in pathos than in policy. Eleanor had weathered these criticisms with a quiet dignity. She knew the power of the documents she had presented. She knew that the truth, however uncomfortable, had a way of resonating, even if only within the hushed confines of university libraries and academic conferences. The Ashworth family, as predicted, remained aloof. The current Lord Ashworth, a city financier with little interest in his family's more distant past beyond its value as social currency, had delegated the matter to his solicitors, who issued a bland statement about respecting historical inquiry, while cautioning against drawing definitive conclusions from incomplete or private records. It was a carefully constructed dismissal, designed to protect the family name from any taint of ancestral wrongdoing. Eleanor hadn't expected otherwise. Her aim had not been to indict the Ashworths, but to understand Elias Thorne and Livia Ferrars. The most moving responses to her book came not from established academics, but from younger students, from individuals outside the historical profession who stumbled upon the story and were touched by its human drama. She received letters from people who saw parallels in their own lives, in unspoken regrets, in moral compromises made under pressure, in the enduring pain of lost connections. One young woman, a translator herself, wrote to say that Livia Ferrars had become an inspiration to her, a reminder of the courage it sometimes took to pursue truth and intellectual integrity in a world that often valued expediency above all else. Eleanor began to receive invitations to speak about her work. At one such lecture, at a small literary festival in the West Country, an elderly woman approached her afterwards, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dr. Vance," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. I am a distant relative of Alaric Finch. My grandmother was his niece. He was a very quiet man, my grandmother used to say, always with his books. She said he carried a sadness about him, though she never knew why. Your book, it has given us a piece of him we never knew. Thank you." Eleanor was profoundly moved. It was a reminder that the ripples of these long-ago lives continued to spread, touching people in unexpected ways. She continued her own academic career, moving on to other research projects, other historical puzzles. But the story of Thorne, Livia and Finch remained a touchstone for her, a private measure against which she judged other historical narratives. She often revisited the letters, the journal, the poignant image of the lacquered box with its fragile contents. She thought often of Elias Thorne's silence. Was it cowardice, or was it a form of profound, inarticulable grief, a recognition that some betrayals were beyond words, beyond apology? His unsent letters suggested a desperate need to communicate, to confess, but also a paralyzing fear of Livia's judgment, or perhaps a belief that he had forfeited the right to her attention, even her scorn. And Livia. Eleanor imagined her in Paris, struggling to survive, her brilliance dimmed by poverty and official disdain, perhaps wondering what had happened to the intellectual camaraderie she had shared with the Englishman, Elias Thorne. Had she felt anger, bewilderment, or just a slow, crushing disappointment? The historical record was largely silent on her emotional state, offering only the bare facts of her decline and death. It was Thorne's surviving words that gave her a voice in absentia, his guilt painting a portrait of the woman he had wronged. Alaric Finch, too, remained a figure of fascination for Eleanor. His quiet loyalty, his patient dedication to preserving Thorne's legacy, not just the public achievements, but the private torment, seemed a remarkable act of devotion. He had not sought fame or recognition for himself. He had simply understood the importance of the human story and had taken it upon himself to be its careful, respectful custodian. His decision to seal the most sensitive documents for 50 years was a masterstroke of discretion and foresight, allowing passions to cool, reputations to fade, and the truth to emerge in a more objective, if still poignant, light. Years later, when Eleanor was a distinguished professor herself, a new wing was added to the Cambridge College Library. As part of the inauguration, a small exhibition was mounted, showcasing some of the library's more unusual holdings. Eleanor was asked to curate the section on Elias Thorne and Alaric Finch. She chose carefully, a facsimile page from Thorne's journal, showing his anguished entry about the memorandum, Livia's cheerful note to Elias, a stark contrast to the tragedy that followed. One of Elias's unsent letters, its ink faded but its emotional intensity still palpable, and a photograph of Alaric Finch in his later years, a quiet, scholarly man with sad, kind eyes. And, of course, the lacquered box, its contents now carefully preserved, the miniature of Livia Ferrars, the centrepiece. Beneath the display, Eleanor placed a simple card. The Elias Thorne Collection, a legacy of intellect, a burden of conscience. These artifacts tell a story of public duty and private anguish, of a brilliant mind grappling with the moral complexities of his time. They also speak of the enduring power of memory and the quiet dedication of Alaric Finch, who ensured that a difficult truth and a profound human story would not be lost to the silence of the past. Students and visitors would linger before the display. Some, perhaps, who had read Eleanor's book, would understand the full depth of the tragedy and the redemption held within those few, fragile objects. Others might simply see a collection of historical curiosities. But for Eleanor it was a culmination, a bringing of the story full circle. She thought of Elias Thorne, sitting in his dusty Bloomsbury rooms, the weight of his unspoken guilt pressing down on him. She thought of him refusing food, refusing solace, his only companionship, the ghosts of his past. His was a decline born not just of age or illness, but of a soul corroded by regret, a powerful intellect turned inward, endlessly replaying a single devastating choice. His mask of scholarly detachment, of stoic endurance, had hidden a wound that never healed. And she thought of Queen Elizabeth I, another powerful figure from England's past, whose final days were also marked by a profound melancholy, a retreat from the world, a silence that spoke volumes. Different centuries, different circumstances, but the same human heart, capable of immense strength and devastating vulnerability. The burden of power, the weight of past actions, the unassuageable grief, these were themes that transcended time, linking the Virgin Queen in her tapestried halls at Richmond with the tormented scholar in his book-lined London study. Eleanor Vance knew that history was full of such silences, such hidden stories. Her work was to listen for them, to piece together the fragments, to give voice where possible to those who could no longer speak for themselves. The Thorne Ferrers Finch archive was a testament to that endeavour. A story of decline, yes, but also a story of remembrance, and ultimately of a truth brought painstakingly and tenderly into the light. The dust, as Elias Thorne had known, was democratic, but sometimes with patience and care a human hand could sift through it and find, still faintly beating, the heart of a story worth telling. The establishment of the Thorne Ferrers exhibit, small as it was, seemed to breathe a new, albeit quiet, life into their story within the college. It became a talking point for a new generation of students, not just those studying history or literature, but those in philosophy, in law, in political science. The narrative Eleanor had meticulously reconstructed from Alaric Finch's careful preservation offered a potent case study in ethics, in the long-term consequences of individual choices made under pressure, and in the complex interplay between personal integrity and public duty. One afternoon, Eleanor found a young undergraduate, a philosophy student named James, staring intently at the display. He had a copy of the Thorne ciphers tucked under his arm. "Professor Vance?" he asked, looking up as she approached. I've been reading your book and looking at these letters. It's quite something." "It is," Eleanor agreed, a faint smile touching her lips. "What strikes you most, James?" He paused, considering. "Thorne's silence, I think. The unsent letters. He writes with such agony, such clarity about his own failings. Why not send them? Even if Livia Ferrars had rejected him, wouldn't the act of sending them, of confessing directly to her, have offered him some release? It was a question Eleanor had pondered many times. "Perhaps," she said slowly. "But consider the man, James. Elias Thorne, as Alaric Finch also perceived, was a man of immense, almost stifling pride, not in an arrogant sense, but in his intellectual integrity. To have failed so profoundly by his own standards, to have betrayed not just a friend but his own core beliefs. Perhaps sending those letters felt like a further imposition on Livia. Perhaps he felt he had forfeited any right to her attention, even her condemnation. Or perhaps," she added more softly, "he simply couldn't bear the thought of her definitive rejection, her articulate scorn, which he knew he deserved. The silence, the unsent confession, allowed him to control the narrative of his own remorse, in a way." "So, the silence was another form of control?" James mused. "Like Queen Elizabeth I, in her final days, refusing to name her successor, refusing to speak, a last assertion of will." Eleanor was struck by the parallel. "That's an astute comparison, James. Yes, I think there's a strong element of that. For figures who have wielded great influence, or who have lived by the power of their intellect and their words, silence can become a final potent weapon, or a shield. A refusal to yield completely to the forces that are overwhelming them, be it political pressure, physical decline, or in Thorne's case, the crushing weight of guilt." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, contemplating the faded ink on Elias's unsent letter to Livia. "It also makes one think about Alaric Finch," James continued. "His patience, his reverence almost, to dedicate so much of his life to preserving Thorne's memory, even the painful parts. Most people would want to sanitize the legacy of a mentor they admired." "Alaric was a remarkable man," Eleanor affirmed. "He understood that Thorne's greatness, his humanity, lay not in a flawless record, but in the complexity of his struggle. He saw that the profound melancholy which shadowed Thorne was not a sign of weakness to be hidden, but an integral part of his story, a testament to the depth of his feeling and the severity of his self-judgment. Alaric didn't just preserve documents, he preserved a human soul in all its flawed dignity." The conversation stayed with Eleanor. It reinforced her belief that the story she had helped bring to light was not merely an academic exercise. It resonated with fundamental questions about how we live, how we make choices, and how we reckon with the consequences. Over the years, other small discoveries occasionally surfaced. A distant Ashworth descendant clearing out an old family estate found a brief dismissive mention of Thorne's protégé, Ferrars, in the elder Lord Ashworth's private diary, a chillingly casual reference to the woman whose life had been so profoundly impacted by his actions. A distant Ashworth descendant clearing out an old family estate found a brief dismissive mention of Thorne's protégé, Ferrars, in the elder Lord Ashworth's private diary, a chillingly casual reference to the woman whose life had been namned. It added little to the known facts, but it underscored the callousness of the power structures Elias Thorne had navigated. Eleanor also encouraged further research into Alaric Finch's own, more modest scholarly contributions. She found that his later works, though ostensibly on unrelated historical topics, were often imbued with a subtle preoccupation with themes of loyalty, betrayal, and the often unseen burdens of conscience. It was as if his long immersion in Elias Thorne's tragic silence had irrevocably shaped his own intellectual and moral landscape. The Elias Thorne scholarship continued to support young scholars grappling with ethical dilemmas. Each year, Eleanor would meet with the recipients, sharing the story behind the endowment, encouraging them to consider not just the grand sweep of history, but the individual lives, the personal choices that lay at its heart. She would often point to the exhibit in the library. "Look at them," she would say. "Thorne, the powerful intellect brought low by a single moral failing. Livia, the brilliant idealist crushed by a system she sought to improve. Finch, the quiet scholar who understood that truth and empathy are sometimes the most profound forms of remembrance. Their story is a microcosm of so much that is noble and so much that is tragic in the human endeavour." As Eleanor herself grew older, approaching the age Elias Thorne had been when Alaric Finch first came into his life, she found her own perspective on the story subtly shifting. The academic thrill of discovery had long since faded, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative empathy. She understood more keenly now the weight of years, the accumulation of small regrets, the way the past could cling like ivy, beautiful and destructive. She never tired of telling their story, in lectures, in essays, in quiet conversations with students. For her it had become more than just a historical account. It was a meditation on the fragility of reputation, the persistence of guilt, and the redemptive power of understanding. It was a testament to the fact that even in silence, even across the chasm of centuries, a human voice, if listened for carefully enough, could still be heard. The dust in the Cambridge Library, much like the dust in Elias Thorne's Bloomsbury study, continued its indifferent settling. But now, thanks to the chain of connection, from Elias's torment to Livia's tragic fate to Alaric's devoted remembrance to Eleanor's scholarly pursuit, a small, clear space had been made within it. A space where a story of profound human experience could breathe and continue to speak to those who were willing to listen. The silence had been broken, not by a shout, but by a series of persistent, empathetic whispers, carried forward through time. And in those whispers, Eleanor Vance found a profound and lasting meaning. One late afternoon, as the winter light faded outside her own college window, casting long shadows across her book-strewn desk, Eleanor Vance received an unexpected visitor. He was a young man, not much older than her student James had been years ago, with an earnest expression and a slightly hesitant demeanour. He introduced himself as Thomas Ashton, a junior archivist from the National Archives at Kew. "Professor Vance," he began, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm here because of your work on Elias Thorne, specifically on Lord Ashworth, the elder one, Thorne's patron." Eleanor felt a familiar flicker of interest. "Please come in, Mr. Ashton. What have you found?" Thomas Ashton sat, perching on the edge of a worn armchair, and opened a battered briefcase. "It's rather strange, Professor. We've been recataloguing a section of unindexed Foreign Office papers from the early 19th century, materials that were deemed too sensitive for release at the time, and then simply forgotten, it seems. Among them I found a very small personal ledger. It belonged to the elder Lord Ashworth." Eleanor leaned forward. "Ashworth's personal ledger?" The man had been notoriously discreet. "Most of it is estate accounts, gambling debts, appointments," Ashton continued, "but there are a few pages towards the end, written in a very agitated hand, that are different. They refer to the French affair of '08 and to Thorn's cleverness. And then there's this." He carefully extracted a single folded sheet of paper from the ledger and handed it to Eleanor. It was not in Ashworth's hand. It was the elegant, feminine script she knew so well, Livia Ferrars. But this was not a cheerful note about Parian marbles. It was a formal, though clearly distressed, letter addressed to Lord Ashworth himself. "My lord," it read, in French, "I am informed, through channels I cannot doubt, that suspicions of a most grievous nature have fallen upon me. I am accused, it seems, of betraying the trust of my delegation and of England, a country for which I hold a deep, albeit complex, affection. I do not know the source of these calumnies, but I implore you, my lord, as a man of honour and as one who has always professed a commitment to justice, to investigate this matter with the utmost rigour. I have served faithfully. My conscience is clear. I place my reputation, indeed my future, in your hands, trusting that truth will prevail. Your servant, Livia Ferrars." Eleanor stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Livia had written to Ashworth, appealing to his honour. And Ashworth had possessed this letter. "There's more, Professor," Ashton said, his voice low. "On the reverse of this letter, in Ashworth's own hand, is a single scribbled note. It appears to be a draft for a reply, or perhaps just his thoughts." Eleanor turned the fragile page over. There, in Ashworth's spiky, impatient script, were a few damning words. "Ferrars, too clever by half, knows too much, Thorn to handle, silence essential, dispose. Dispose." The word hung in the air between them, cold and brutal. It wasn't just that Ashworth had allowed suspicion to fall on Livia. It wasn't just that he had allowed Elias Thorn to subtly orchestrate her downfall to protect him. Ashworth had actively, consciously chosen to sacrifice her. He had seen her appeal to his honour, and his response had been to ensure her silence, her disposal from the political chessboard. "This," Eleanor breathed, "this changes the emphasis considerably. Thorn bore immense guilt for his silence, his culpable inaction, but this suggests Ashworth was far more actively malevolent in his intent towards Livia. Thorn may have been a pawn, albeit a highly intelligent and morally compromised one, in a much colder game played by his patron." "That's what I thought, Professor," Ashton said. "Thorn's letters, the ones you published, speak of his own betrayal, but they don't hint that he knew the full extent of Ashworth's ruthlessness. Perhaps Thorn believed he was merely deflecting suspicion from Ashworth onto Livia as a lesser, regrettable necessity. He may not have known Ashworth actively wanted her disposed of because she knew too much, perhaps about Ashworth's own dealings." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of sorrow, this time for Elias Thorn. If he had acted, however wrongly, believing he was managing a difficult situation, only to realise later, or perhaps never fully realise, that he was an instrument in a far more cynical and destructive plot by his master, his guilt would have been compounded by a terrible sense of having been used, his own moral compass shattered not just by his weakness, but by Ashworth's calculating evil. "This ledger, Mr. Ashton," Eleanor said, her voice tight with emotion, "and this letter, they are of immense significance." "I believed so," he replied. "That's why I came to you. My superiors at the archives are cautious. They speak of context and not jumping to conclusions. The Ashworth name still carries some weight even now, but after reading your book I felt you would understand." "I do," Eleanor said, "and I am profoundly grateful to you for bringing this to me. This doesn't exonerate Elias Thorn. His actions, his silence, still had devastating consequences for Livia Ferrars. But it casts his tragedy and hers in an even starker, more complex light. He was not just a man battling his own conscience. He was also a man ensnared by a patron who was, it seems, utterly without one. The discovery of Ashworth's ledger and Livia's desperate, unanswered appeal added a final chilling chapter to the story Eleanor Vance had so carefully pieced together. It didn't change the outcome of Livia's life, or the decades of Elias Thorn's silent grief. But it deepened the shadows, revealing a colder, more deliberate malice at the heart of the initial betrayal. Eleanor knew she would have to write about this, an addendum to her book, perhaps, or a new article. The story of Thorn, Livia, and Finch was not, it seemed, entirely finished. History, she reflected, was like that. It rarely offered neat conclusions. It was a palimpsest, new layers of understanding constantly being written over old, each discovery revealing a more intricate and often more troubling pattern. The image of Livia Ferrars, appealing to the honour of a man who possessed none, and of Elias Thorne, unknowingly serving a master whose cynicism far outstripped his own agonised pragmatism, would stay with Eleanor for a long time. It was a reminder that the pursuit of truth was an ongoing process, and that even in the dustiest archives, the echoes of past injustices and the faint whispers of unheard pleas could still be found by those who were patient enough and courageous enough to listen. The weight of power, Eleanor thought, not only burdened those who wielded it, like Queen Elizabeth or Elias Thorne in his advisory capacity, but it could also corrupt absolutely, as it seemed to have done with the elder Lord Ashworth. And the casualties of that corruption were often the Livias of the world, the brilliant, the idealistic, the inconveniently principled, whose lives were extinguished or derailed, their voices silenced, their stories buried, waiting for a future hand to ever so carefully bring them back into the light. And the casualties of that corruption were often the Livias of the world, the brilliant, the idealistic, the inconveniently principled, whose lives were extinguished or derailed, their voices silenced, their stories buried, waiting for a future hand to ever so. The new revelations from Lord Ashworth's ledger prompted Eleanor Vance to embark on what she knew would likely be her final significant contribution to the Thorne Ferrers saga. She felt a duty, not just to historical accuracy, but to the memories of Elias and Livia, to present this more complete, if harsher, picture. Alaric Finch, she mused, would have pursued this new thread with his characteristic quiet diligence, had he known of it. Now it fell to her. She spent months re-examining every document, every journal entry in light of Ashworth's cold-blooded note. Ferrars. Too clever by half. Knows too much. Thorne to handle. Silence essential. Dispose. The words resonated with a chilling finality, casting Elias Thorne's subsequent actions and his lifelong guilt into a new relief. Had Thorne been explicitly instructed to dispose of Livia, not in a lethal sense, but to ensure her complete discrediting and removal? Or had Ashworth's instruction been more subtly conveyed, trusting Thorne's intellect and loyalty to achieve the desired outcome without spelling out the brutal specifics? Eleanor suspected the latter. The elder Lord Ashworth was a master of delegation, of achieving his aims through intermediaries, thus maintaining a veneer of deniability. Thorne, with his nuanced understanding of language and his skill in crafting persuasive, if ambiguous, memoranda, would have been the perfect instrument. Perhaps Ashworth had merely expressed his grave concern about Mademoiselle Ferrars' indiscreet connections and her potential to embarrass the government, leaving it to Thorne to interpret the necessary measures. This interpretation, Eleanor felt, did not lessen Thorne's culpability for his silence and his subtle misdirection of the inquiry, but it did frame his actions within a context of immense pressure from a ruthless and powerful patron. Thorne's agony, then, might have stemmed not only from his betrayal of Livia's friendship and trust, but also from the dawning, or perhaps lifelong, suspicion that he had been a more manipulated pawn than he cared to admit. His own intellectual pride compromised by Ashworth's cynical realpolitik. Her resulting monograph, The Ashworth Directive, Complicity and Conscience in the Thorne Affair, was published 2 years later. It was a slim volume, densely argued, and aimed squarely at the academic community. In it, she laid out the new evidence, analysing Ashworth's terse command within the broader context of early 19th century diplomatic manoeuvring, where careers and sometimes lives were readily sacrificed for political expediency. She painted a portrait of Elias Thorne as a man caught in an impossible vise, his loyalty to Ashworth, who had been his benefactor and protector for years, his intellectual vanity, which perhaps led him to believe he could navigate this treacherous situation without irreparable damage, and his burgeoning, unspoken affection and admiration for Livia Ferrars, whose idealism represented everything he was being asked to betray. His choice, Eleanor argued, was a tragic failure of moral courage, but a failure conditioned by the brutal pragmatism of his master and the high stakes of the political game. Livia Ferrars emerged from this new analysis as even more of a victim, not just of circumstantial misfortune or a colleague's weakness, but of a deliberate, targeted effort by a powerful nobleman to silence a woman who knew too much. What exactly Livia knew that made her so dangerous to Ashworth remained tantalizingly unclear. Perhaps it concerned his financial dealings, his undisclosed French contacts, or the true extent of his incompetence or corruption that Thorne was constantly trying to mitigate. The ledger offered no further clues on that specific point. The publication of the Ashworth Directive did cause a stir, particularly as it directly implicated a prominent historical figure like Lord Ashworth in a more active and malicious role than previously understood. The current Ashworth family, through their solicitors, issued an even frostier statement this time, speaking of unsubstantiated allegations and the tarnishing of a distinguished public servant's name based on fragmentary and misinterpreted jottings. They hinted at legal action, though none ever materialized. The evidence, though sparse, was too damningly direct. For Eleanor, the book felt like a necessary corrective, a final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. It didn't offer easy answers or comfortable resolutions. Elias Thorne remained a tragic figure, his guilt profound and deserved, but now his tragedy was shared, in a sense, with the understanding of the immense and corrupting pressure he had faced from above. Livia's fate seemed even more unjust, her intelligence and integrity making her a direct threat to a powerful, unscrupulous man. The exhibit in the Cambridge College Library was updated to include a reference to Ashworth's ledger and Livia's appeal. The narrative became richer, darker, more complex. Students discussing the Thorne ciphers now had to grapple with new layers of complicity and betrayal. Eleanor, now in the twilight of her own distinguished career, often found herself thinking about the chain of preservation that had allowed this story to unfold. Livia's desperate unheard appeal, Elias's unsent anguished letters and his haunted journal, Alaric Finch's quiet, steadfast dedication to preserving these fragments of a broken life, Thomas Ashton's serendipitous discovery in a dusty archive. Each link had been crucial. It was a testament, she felt, to the often haphazard yet sometimes miraculously persistent way in which truth can survive. She imagined Alaric Finch, were he alive to read the Ashworth Directive. He would, she thought, have absorbed the new information with his characteristic quiet thoughtfulness. It would have deepened his understanding of his mentor's suffering, perhaps offering a sliver of context that might have, in some small way, lessened the burden of Elias's self-blame, though never excusing the betrayal of Livia. Finch, Eleanor knew, was not interested in excuses, only in the fullest possible understanding of the human heart in all its complexity. The story of Elias Thorne and Livia Ferrars, amplified by the quiet dedication of Alaric Finch and the scholarly persistence of Eleanor Vance and Thomas Ashton, had finally stepped out of the deepest shadows. It served as a somber reminder that behind the grand facades of history, behind the celebrated names and the official narratives, lie countless individual stories of moral compromise, hidden grief, and the enduring search for meaning and justice. The silence of Elias Thorne, born of guilt and pressure, had, through many hands and across many years, been transformed into a narrative that continued to speak, a cautionary tale for any who believed that power came without a profound and often terrible human cost. And in that transformation, Eleanor found a quiet, scholarly satisfaction. The work was done.